use its resources, its agencies, its employees in implementing that law. I mean, if we think it's a bad law, and I happen to think it is a bad law, why would we use state tax dollars to implement it when we're not constitutionally and legally required to do so? So the first thing my amendment does is say that the state's not going to aid and abet in the implementation of this law. The second thing it does is it says that we're not going to go ahead and set up a state-created exchange, healthcare exchange. We're not going to accept the optional expansion of Medicaid. We're not going to accept programs under the Affordable Care Act unless they have been reviewed by the legislature and we understand the strings that are attached to them. We need to understand what obligations we're undertaking before we accept federal money. And the last thing we do is set some baseline registration and regulation of navigators to make sure they're giving truthful information to the South Carolinians. So those are 5 components of the amendment. They're all legal and constitutional. I've worked with the governor's office on this. I've worked with lawyers on this. And we'll explain this and we'll have a vote on it.
Almost every week for the past couple of months, there's been protesters outside. There's protesters here today saying that about 1,000 people a year will die because we did not extend Medicaid. What do you say to that portion of our viewing audience who?
I don't accept the premise. I think Tony Keck at Health and Human Services has been an excellent case for why it's not in the best interest of South Carolinians to expand Medicaid as authorized by the Affordable Care Act. We have people under the existing program that have not been covered. He's focusing on the neediest of those. I think he's being very innovative in improving healthcare outcomes. I trust what Tony Keck has done, and I want him to continue that work.
Now, when you talk about putting additional regulations on the navigators, why do you feel this is necessary? You mentioned that they may be distributing untruthful information. Tell me about that.
Well, Congress has appropriated hundreds of millions of dollars to be spent throughout the country in order to have people enroll in the Affordable Care Act exchanges. We simply want to make sure they're giving truthful information to people, just like anybody else in South Carolina who is selling a product.
What is the timeline for this debate?
Well, we started today, and I guess it will go for as long as senators have questions. So it's hard to determine in that regard.
Anything we didn't talk about that you think people should know about what you're trying to do here?
I think it's important to understand that what we are doing is not nullified. I mean, the bill is referred to as a nullification bill. It is not that. We are exercising our rights as recognized by the United States Supreme Court to not have state resources spent to implement a federal law. We're not saying the law is illegal. We're not going to try to ban enforcement in South Carolina. But we have no constitutional obligation to spend state resources to implement what I consider and what many consider to be a bad federal law. Since we have no obligation in that regard, why would we do it?
There's been some confusion about the funding and the process that has to go through for federal programs and grants, how that may conflict with universities trying to receive federal funding. Will that be clarified on the floor?
Well, if there's a program, if there's a grant that serves a good and compelling public purpose, they can appear in a public hearing. They can explain why they're applying for the grant. The public can listen, and if it's a good purpose, the grant will be approved. I mean, if it's for a good purpose, they should have no fear of open scrutiny of that. Thank you, ma'am.